take a moment to let everyone know that once this meeting is over, again, it will be recorded, and we'll be directing users to a YouTube link that you can watch this video immediately after the meeting. And I'd like to start by saying that the City of Bend recognizes the immense work and time that you all have put into this short-term task force. And on behalf of the entire City of Bend, we want to thank you for your time, your expertise, and your willingness to dedicate time to this important work. Over the past year, the City of Bend has partnered with Allyship in Action, as many of you know, and through a contract that's been primarily focused on the City Council goals, specifically embedding a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the other part of that was to publish statistics. And I wanted to let you all know that although the City Council goal is to provide those statistics by June 30th, we have been delayed due to COVID. And so we will be those results will be published probably within the next 2 months. So I apologize for that delay and appreciate your patience as we pull those numbers and that data together. The majority of today's meeting will be facilitated by Aaron Rook of Allyship in Action. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aaron Rook, unless there are other, Eric, is there anything else that I'm missing? Thanks for, it's my first time facilitating a public meeting. Okay, so Aaron, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. I'll also fess up to being a first timer in the facilitating a public meeting department, so appreciate everyone's grace with that. On that note, I was wondering if we wanted to give it a couple minutes, or if it's okay if we go through kind of these introductory pieces as we're having more task force members join on, because I don't think we have everyone quite in the room, so to speak, yet. I'm not sure what the typical approach is on that piece. Is there a preference in terms of waiting or moving forward?
Aaron, maybe why don't you, if you wouldn't mind sharing the names of all of the current task force members, and then maybe as we go through that list, those who are on the call, if they want to let you know that they're there, that would be great.
Yeah, let me just get that pulled up here real quick. All right. Okay. So Rodrigo Gaspar Barajas, Denise Labuda. I believe I saw her name on there. Are you wanting folks to chime in when they hear their name? Would that be helpful? Yeah. Sorry, here. Would it be helpful if they say their name when I call them out?
I think it'd be nice to see their faces and connect to the face to the name, if that works.
Yeah. So maybe I'll go through who I think we have here. We have Denise Labuda, who I think is maybe calling by phone. So I don't know if she'll be able to show her face, but Denise, do you want to just say, yeah. Oh, there you are.
I'm here. I could not get my audio connected. Sorry, I'm here.
No worries. Thanks for being here. See, it looks like we have Jen Rusk as well.
Kyle.
Hi, Jen.
Hi.
And Joanne Mina.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi, Joanne. I think we also have Keisha Kubota on the call as well.
Hi.
Hi, Keisha. And Ramir Chatterjee. Ramir, are you available to say hello? And well, I believe
can't get my audio to work.
Oh, gotcha. No worries.
There we are. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thanks.
Okay, good.
Good to see you. Is there anyone else that I didn't call? I know there are a few folks that said they weren't going to be able to make the meeting because of scheduling conflicts, but I believe that's who we have with us at the moment. All right, we can move forward. I don't know if we wanted to pull up the slides as we're going through, if that would be helpful for folks to kind of see what we're talking about, or if we were planning to do that, if that's just something people have for their own reference, but gotcha. We wanted to start off before we dive into kind of the content of the agenda to do a land acknowledgement, right? Recognizing the context in which we're coming to this conversation from. And so just wanted to acknowledge that, before white folks called this place Central Oregon, it was a place where indigenous people lived, traveled, traded, fished, and thrived for generations. Those indigenous communities include the Northern Paiute, the Wasco, the Klamath, the Warm Springs people, and others as well. And just to know that, the reason we're able to be here essentially in the city of Bend is due to that displacement of indigenous communities that was formalized when the U.S. government, basically coerced tribes into giving up their right to live on the lands that had traditionally sustained them and relocated them to reservations. Indigenous folks are still very much part of our community today, right? But we just think it's important to acknowledge this history, to both honor the land and the sovereignty of the tribal nations on whose traditional lands we live, work, and recreate. So just wanted to kind of put that out there. There's a slide that speaks to that. Of course, everyone's names that's in the group. But I think the next slide has a graphic that, there we go, thank you so much. That just kind of provides a little context in terms of where Bend sits within what was previously the lands that were of indigenous folks. So thanks for that. I think we're going to start off with that summary of the public comments that we received from Shelley. And then after that, we'll kind of go into just an overview of kind of what we're here to chat about today, what the overall purposes of the meeting and what we hope to accomplish.
Thanks, Erin. We did have two, as I mentioned, public comments. One came through email, one came through the phone. So I'm going to go ahead, since there are two and they're both concise, I'm going to go ahead and read those out loud for this group. The first was the email. The first email is from Michael Funke, and the contents of the email are as follows. Please include this in the public comment section of today's meeting. Bend needs a human rights commission with teeth to adequately deal with issues of racism, bias, discrimination, and hate, not a watered down and toothless committee. It is more than a bit disappointing that in the wake of massive rallies and protests led by people of color in our community, that this is the best the city can come up with. That's the end of the first public comment. The second public comment was left by phone. Bend resident Melanie Keebler expressed her support of the recommendations within in these meeting materials presented by Allyship in Action. She liked the strategies. She encourages the subcommittee to move forward with the recommendations. Ms. Keebler supports a HR commission, human rights commission versus an advisory council. And she does believe that the city needs to be held accountable for moving this process forward in a way that provides a forum for folks in our community to report bias and hate crime. So those are the two public comments, and I have those on file. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, Erin. I appreciate that. So today, really kind of the objective we're hoping to accomplish in this meeting is to really dive back into kind of the needs and priorities that the task force identified, as well as some of the recommendations that you all started coming up with, as well as consider some of the feedback from staff and members of the stewardship subcommittee, so that you can use all of that information to kind of figure out how you want to move forward on finalizing those recommendations to council. So, as a reminder, I think Shelley spoke to, there was the directive to establish the short-term committee to assist in identifying the needs and priorities of underserved and underrepresented communities in Bend. And also one of the council goals was to establish a permanent commission or committee to develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan and seek opportunities to leverage community efforts through funding and support. And so kind of how our scope of work connects to that, we were tasked with establishing a baseline for the city's DEI work through interviews, surveys, engaging with different groups. We also, to lead the establishment of this task force, to provide a series of trainings, and then to make some recommendations to the city for future actions. So just to kind of have that grounding of, the context of where all this is coming from. We could go to the next slide. Thanks so much. Just wanted to briefly walk our way up to kind of where we are right now. We did interview 6 city councilors, as well as 15 external community stakeholders. We did a survey of the city staff to get kind of a baseline of the experiences of staff and where they're coming from. Provided foundational training to 34 city leadership staff, 6 members of council, and 9 other local leaders. And in addition to that, did some presentations, kind of overview presentations to about 8 teams or departments of the city to talk about the efforts underway, and then of course, facilitating this group. You go to the next slide, please. Great. And so just again, an overview of kind of what we're hoping to accomplish is to review and discuss those needs and priorities, review the feedback on the draft recommendations, and then discuss whatever potential revisions or additions, any changes that you might want to make as you finalize those recommendations, and then kind of clarify the next steps for the process. All right, perfect. So before we get into all of that, we wanted to give staff an opportunity to provide some updates on what's going on their side of things, and then we'll dive in to the meat of it.
Great. Thanks. So Erin and the rest of the task force, I'm going to point out a couple of key things that the city has been doing, and then Eric King is going to share some of the collective work across our community that we've been focused on with the DEI initiatives. So as some of you may know, that the City of Bend obviously has the council goals. And the City of Bend staff have been working for over a year on creating internal policies and practices related to DEI. And we kicked off a more intentional call to action at our annual business meeting in March. At that business meeting, it was an opportunity to provide all staff, city staff, with an update of what's happening within the progress towards the DEI initiatives, both internally and externally. Many of most of the part of what we provided was in the call to action was really about engaging individuals, departments and teams, and the organization around what specific strategies they could engage in to help move this forward from those different platforms. As an organization, the City of Bend has really continued to make investments in the ways of a wide array of training opportunities. Staff have been invited to join informal discussion groups that have been facilitated by Dr. Michelle Erickson. We have provided event sponsorships that support underrepresented communities in Bend. And then we've dedicated staff time to supporting the DEI council goals. One of the other areas that the City of Bend has been involved locally is with the Inclusive Innovation Initiative, or I3, as part of their steering committee and their vision development. They have an incredible tool called Building Bridges, Recruitment, Hiring, and Retention Guide, a toolkit for creating a more diverse workforce. A few members of our HR department have participated on the development of that and reviewing that document, as well as integrating some of the key principles of that toolkit within the City of Bend. And then I think the last piece that I wanted to highlight is with all of the impact of COVID, it has, as we know, had a disproportional impact on vulnerable communities. And one of the ways that we're trying to address that is through looking at our council goals and ways that we can revise those to incorporate the negative impacts of COVID-19. So we actually created, based on the state of Oregon's equity framework, we created a document that we'll be presenting to the full council on July 15th, asking for any funds that come in to be, a portion of those to be dedicated to supporting vulnerable populations. And you'll be able to find that document after the July 15th council meeting. I think it's very important as we move forward that we pay attention to opportunities to direct funding to support all types of areas, from communication to direct financial support as it becomes available, to make sure that we help to support those who are most vulnerable in our community. So with that, I will turn it over to Eric to share a little more about the work that the city is doing.
Thanks, Shelley. Yes, beyond that, I think there's been events that have really prompted all of us to think more beyond what we've just included or in what Shelley talked about as part of the council goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion. How can we broaden our impact and think maybe even bigger picture. And we've been talking in this sort of with this framework in mind for the last couple of years of this, what we call kind of a collective impact model or shared governance. What are those topics that that are here in Bend that really that should transcend the silos of government, whether they be school districts, county, city, library, et cetera. We have, just like a lot of cities in this country, kind of a fragmentation of delivering government services, but issues such as mental health, homelessness, diversity, equity, inclusion, they really are bigger issues that we all need to chip in and really, I think our collective, if we join forces, I think we'll have a better impact on making real change. So this idea is something that was codified recently in council goals of pulling ourselves together as local government agencies, and the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, which they're charged with really responding to local government needs. That's sort of in their mission. They're set up through an Oregon state statute to do that work. We've asked for them to pull us together. That started in January, and like most things kind of took a break when COVID hit in March, but it got picked back up. We had our first meeting with schools, library, parks, and the city with the intent to identify those areas of common concern. The number one issue that everybody would like to tackle is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to that end, we've asked for help from allyship to think through what a model might look like, that collective impact shared governance model, to be able to promote the work that's happening already, provide some needed funding to support the work of training and community partnership building, and all, some of the things that are done now on a more ad hoc basis to really sustain some funding. If we all, I think the vision is that we all contribute that. And then what does that organization look like? And there's models out there like Better Together on the education side, and there's the Homeless Leadership Coalition. There are models to explore. And so we're in that process right now of exploring it, and then making sure that we as the city are helping to start the effort, but hopefully having this sort of rest within the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, which is that kind of regional council of government. That was it on my end, unless there's any questions.
Great. Well, we can dive back in to the swing of things, and imagine if people have questions along the way, please ask them, and whoever is able to answer them can. So, just to kind of briefly review where the task force has been so far, and kind of what you all have done previously, and where we're landing today. You all identified some of the needs and priorities of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities in Bend, evaluated existing models for DEI committees and commissions to kind of identify what the common roles, responsibilities, authorities, et cetera, are for those groups. Kind of what are the building blocks that exist out there? How do they work? Identified the ways in which a DEI committee or commission could potentially support the city in meeting those identified needs, right? Including those that are articulated in the council goal of creating a DEI action plan, liaising with community groups. And also, you all had conversations kind of identifying the strengths and weaknesses of a committee versus a commission. So that's kind of, to get folks up to speed that might not be as familiar. I think like that's kind of the gist of what we covered so far. The next slide kind of talks about what remains to be done. So to deliberate on the findings from all of that previous work, including feedback from various sources, and also wanting to recognize that there's a lot going on in the world right now. So the recommendations that you all talked about a month or two ago, you might have a different perspective on those now, right? So want to leave space for that as well. Ultimately we need to finalize those recommendations and feedback on the needs and priorities, and hopefully at the next meeting, assuming folks are ready to do that, vote to approve the final recommendations that you all want to send on to council. So kind of the dates and deadlines that are relevant to that you all should know about. July 28th, city staff are going to present the task force recommendations to the stewardship subcommittee. You might recall, and there were, I think, the meetings in the materials packet, the minutes in the materials packet of the last stewardship subcommittee meeting, where they kind of got that initial introduction to the needs and priorities that you all had identified. So this will be an opportunity for them to get kind of the full picture of the recommendations that you all are making, and kind of ask questions, speak to that, so that when it goes to the full council on the 19th of August, that conversation, some folks on council will have a little more background in that conversation. Does that make sense? Are there questions about kind of the where do we go from here piece? All right. Well, then we can keep on moving forward. Perfect. So before we dive into reflecting on the feedback from the city staff, excuse me, and members of the stewardship subcommittee, I just wanted to make a quick note about kind of the framing of how we're approaching the conversation. One of the documents in the materials was the, I think, called the DEI task force proposed draft recommendations staff feedback. I just want to clarify that that's meant to be a starting point for conversation. And we know that's not, a verbatim translation of the recommendations you all had talked about before. So really just hoping to have that be a starting point for conversation. I just want to remind folks that the task force will, be the ones to ultimately decide what they want to pass on as recommendations, and that will, be in the final report. I realized that the way it was worded in the communication I had sent out maybe wasn't super clear, so wanted to make clarification about that. Are there any questions about that piece? Okay. And then, just briefly wanted to speak to, oh, sorry, we're not quite ready for the next slide yet. Thanks. There's some things that just aren't on the slides. I didn't make a slide for everything, unfortunately, but also just wanted to speak a little bit to, why we're having public meetings now versus not before. I think as all the task force members know, in the beginning, it was conceived of as kind of a city advisory committee to the city, a short-term task force that wouldn't require that kind of engagement, but as it we moved into making recommendations to council, that's the sort of thing that definitely needs to happen in a public space. So sorry, someone's car alarm is going off in the background there. So we just want to make sure, right, that we're creating opportunities for folks to give feedback and and doing as advised. So yeah, now we can. Oh, yeah,
I'm sorry. Before we move away from this slide, I would like to add just some feedback on this particular topic.
Yeah, we're actually, we're just starting on this slide, so this is a perfect time to do that. So we're going to speak a little bit to some of the feedback we got from staff and the stewardship subcommittee members who are members of council. I think one of the first topics, and I think a topic of interest to everyone, right, is this idea of a committee versus a commission. And just to kind of briefly summarize, and I'd love to hear, whatever thoughts Joanne, you or others want to share, is the primary differences, as we understand it, is that a committee, at least in the city of Bend, right, because every city does it a little differently, a committee is typically something that is created by city council or staff, whereas a commission is, in Bend at least, typically tied to a state statute. The scope and authority of a committee within the city code, again, typically limited to making recommendations to council, broadly speaking, whereas a commission usually has its scope of authority defined by that statute. And then the other piece that came up in feedback was that a commission, depending on what all it took on, would potentially have would require a higher level of staff support. And so those were kind of some of the things that were highlighted in those conversations. But I'd be happy to have staff step in and give any additional context there, or hear, Joanne, like you said, the comments or questions you all might have about that. Joanne, did you want to add your thoughts?
Yes, sorry, thank you. So just want to reiterate that the conversation that we center as a task force was around creating a human rights and equity commission. That is the intention, I think, of the majority of us. The idea being that our city, not just the region, but yes, our city of Bend needs an independent body where citizens can go to be seen, be heard, but also to help them in the process of seeking justice. And that is basically the foundation of the work that we're trying to do here. It's because of the needs of the community. And the idea of creating a commission gives the community agency. And that's what we're trying to do with this work. It's not necessarily doing DEI work. Our drive as task force is to create shared power among all members of our community. So a commission will be a body of governance that would create that shared power, but also agency that we're looking for our marginalized and underrepresented community members. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Other questions or responses to Joanne's comment, or other thoughts that folks want to share about this idea of the differences between a committee versus a commission? Yeah, I think the main takeaway I've gotten from our conversations with staff was, I think, around.
Ramir needs to share his microphone.
Sorry, who's trying to share?
Ramir, if you can unmute, or if the host of the meeting can unmute Ramir, that'd be great, please.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Joanne. I'd just like to reinforce what Joanne said. I'm not sure what all the legal ramifications may be of establishing a commission, but there is more than just a symbolic importance attached to a commission. A commission, in my view, versus a committee, doesn't require a lot of thought in terms of trying to understand what the difference is. A commission implies a certain long-term view of the problems that we want to address. It involves a commitment to the people that we expect to serve. And a committee it could be a sort of garden committee or a canaster committee. I don't know what I think a committee has much less weight behind it. We understand that a commission is not a judicial body, but it can certainly serve in a long-term capacity to help with those who feel they don't have access either to justice or to services or to a lot of other things that today are ignored. I was under the impression that the City Council wanted such a long-term view of the problem. And a commission, it seems to me, serves such a purpose. It implies an advisory role, but it also implies independence. We need a commission that is independent of other components of the city, although it doesn't mean that we don't work in a consultative way. I think that is a very important issue, that a commission has some independence to both pursue specific objectives and to advise. That advisory role has to be conducted in an independent way. And I think a commission lends some weight to that process. Thank you.
I'd like to share some thoughts as well, if I may. Hi, everyone. Rodrigo here. I just want to apologize for being gone previously, and thank you all for making this space. I want to reiterate the points that Ramir and Joanne made, and maybe offer a complementary framing, because I agree that the commission should be the way that we go, precisely for the points that Joanne and Ramir have made about the the shared power and the independence that this would create for communities of color and other marginalized communities, and frame this actually as the more equitable decision to make, right? I think that what I've seen in the community as far as EDI work has been really approached as projects of assimilation, right? Where we just wrap people into these systems and then that fixes everything. But equity is really about sharing resources and power. Our communities have been historically disempowered, not having power to make the decisions, and this would be one small way to give people some of that agency and disrupt really the same paternalistic power dynamics where white people stay in positions of power and people of color are given sort of these cosmetic positions where we can give recommendations but have no actual independence. And so, yes, my support is for the commission and for the sharing of power.
Thanks. I don't know if there are other folks that want to share comments. I just want to highlight the themes I'm hearing. I think are really seem to be around independence, agency, and shared power. If that sounds right, kind of the themes I'm hearing out of the comments I've heard so far. Are there other folks, or do you either, because I know there were reference to kind of council intent in there as well. I don't know if either of the counselors on the call want to speak to that, or if our staff have follow-up questions or things that they want to add to that as well.
This is Bruce Abernethy, and I'm happy to weigh in. And I want to, again, this is the first time I've had a chance to, can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
So one of the questions that I have, and I guess what I would say is, I want to be really clear. I am not necessarily opposed to a commission, but as somebody that hasn't been as involved in the discussions that you guys have, I don't feel like the case has been made that you need a commission as opposed to some other model. There's a part of me that people keep talking about it. I'm also concerned that this is a little bit beyond actually what the council asked, and so I totally get that you guys are going for what you believe is right, but I just want to kind of weigh in that from my perspective, it seems to me like there's sort of this, like, it's a commission or nothing, and no other model will work. And I haven't seen the stats, or I guess what I would say is help me understand, or maybe give me some examples of what a human rights commission in another community has done that we could do because we need it here in Bend. And maybe it's just because I haven't been informed, but from my perspective, I don't think the case has been made why you absolutely need a commission, as opposed to some other creative model that I think Eric and a lot of the other government agencies are looking at. That's my 2 cents.
I'll just respond a little bit to that in part, Bruce. First of all, I think part of what we asked the task force to do was to provide a recommendation on commission versus committee. So I don't think it's beyond the scope of what we asked them to do, because we asked them to provide a recommendation and that's what they're doing. Maybe it goes beyond the scope of what we had in mind, but the reason I felt we needed to ask for a recommendation was that I didn't know what was needed, because I'm not a member of a marginalized community, so I can't know what is needed. So this is the recommendation that's coming to us. I think if we feel like it would be better received by council with some more specific examples, that's good feedback for the consultants and for the task force to incorporate that in to their argument for it. But I don't think that necessarily the commission idea is out of line with what Eric is talking about. And I'm actually personally wondering if we might need both of these things, the way that Beaverton has them. I don't want to be duplicative, obviously, but because both will require resources. But there are certain things that a commission that the commission doesn't necessarily do that may still be needed, like the action planning piece of this, which also seems like it could provide real value for.
Yeah.
So, that's my response to some of that.
Yeah, maybe if I could build off of what. Sorry about that. If I could build off of what Jenna was saying, I think that as the chart points out that's on the slide, council has the authority to create a committee. Council does not have authority to create a commission. We would need statutory authority from the state to do that. That's a difficult process. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it might be like a two-step approach of get a committee formed to really fine tune the scope, make the case, really create, what a commission would look like and put that focus on it. So I don't think it's a question of, need or whatnot. I think there's openness to the idea. It's just how do you build towards it, given the city council only has so much authority. So I think we were trying to find a way to incorporate what we heard from, at least through allyship, the feedback of the meetings that you've had to date. And I think what we were kind of digesting was maybe let's start with the committee that would work, that part of their work scope of this committee that council has the authority to appoint would be to really fully scope this idea of a human rights commission.
Can I weigh in for a quick second? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ian Lighthizer, one of the attorneys at the city attorney's office. And I think I think it'll be helpful, I hope, to point out that while the committee commission dichotomy is, I think, useful shorthand for people when they talk about what a body is going to be and what it can do, it's not really that clean. And by way of example, there are several cities, Beaverton, Eugene, I think Portland and Seattle too, that have what they call commissions, but these are bodies that largely serve advisory roles to city government, city council. Some of them provide conciliatory services like mediation, restorative justice services that can help people try to identify issues and solve problems largely on a voluntary participatory basis. But even some of these bodies that are called commissions don't really have enforcement authority like some people might think they do. So while the nomenclature, the terms are useful as we talk about concepts for what recommendations might ultimately be made in terms of what this body or maybe multiple bodies should be, the devil is really in the details. And at some point you're going to need to start talking about, and I'm sure you already have, what exactly do you think this body, whether it's called a committee or a commission, is going to be empowered to do? It seems obvious to me that examining issues, identifying sources of problems, and making recommendations on a permanent basis should be part of it. But there are other questions. What do you want them to be able to do in terms of providing services to people, and what do you want them to be able to do in terms of providing either dispute resolution for problems or creating jurisdiction to enforce complaints that come to them? So that's where I think it gets really interesting, and that's really independent of this discussion about committee or commission, because there are plenty of commissions that don't have the ability to do those things. They don't really have the ability to enforce complaints in sort of a punitive way outside of parties agreeing to participate in some kind of conciliation process. So that'll be an interesting part of the discussion. And this group is going to have to get to that point, I think, fairly quickly. What do you really want them to be able to do?
So I'm hearing a couple different questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to share, I think some really great points have been made, but I just want to come back to, I guess the point that I wanted to make is that I think regardless of what we decide to call it, a commission or a committee, that understanding needs to, the understanding that we were talking about this being a mechanism towards sharing power, needs to be the basis of what we decide to do. Personally, I would like the commission to have the power to investigate instances of mistreatment. So, for example, I used to be an interpreter at the clinics and at the hospital, and the number of folks who would be treated poorly by their physicians, who would be given less time with them, less advice, or less time to talk about what the procedures are, less time to talk about what the repercussions are. Those things I saw routinely. And yes, it's anecdotal, right? But if there was a place where people could bring those kinds of concerns and complaints, and then that body would have the power to investigate if some sort of discriminatory thing was happening, then that would be the, that I would like to see that kind of thing happen, and the commission or committee have that kind of power, and I think too, like Joanne said, a place where people can go seek justice, right? Like there are people who need help with investigating like potential hate crimes, right? Like this is an example of what happened in Redmond, right? But that incident that happened with that woman who was attacked, like an independent body should have investigated that, right? Or I'm sorry, I had another example and it just flew out of my mind. But just to reiterate that whatever the decision is that the city council makes, that understanding and that commitment to empowering people to be in control of the decisions that the commission makes should be at the heart of what we decide to do.
If I could chime in quickly, I first would like to acknowledge the power dynamics at play during this meeting. There are 3 people of color that have shared why we have recommended a commission, and we have white people in power asking, well, convince me that that's what you really need. And I think the work we are doing is because we have recognized that those dynamics of convince me, tell me more, is it really necessary? It's what is causing inequities, right? It is what is not only impacting people now with COVID-19, but these struggles have been here all along, right? So it's important that we acknowledge that the people impacted by inequities are their experts on what that life experience is. At the beginning of the meeting, I appreciate all the sharing about what the city's done to create equity, diversity, and inclusion already. But I see the response to COVID-19, and I know for a fact, Spanish speakers in our community were an afterthought, a very later on afterthought. About the issues of injustices and where people need a place to go, I would like to add the example of all of the folks that need to apply for financial assistance, for rental assistance, and that are asked a letter from their employer proving that they have been laid off or that their hours have been reduced. And the amounts of comments that I've seen from the community about my employer won't answer my phone, I am not their priority, just the fear, right? This power dynamic that people have to ask for the very basic of recognition of their work so that they can access services is the reason why we're doing this work. So I hope that as we move forward in this meeting and in all other conversations, that we all center those impacted by inequities. Thank you.
Are there other folks that want to share? I think there were a couple of questions that emerged earlier that I think a couple of folks have already spoken to in terms of the kind of the why task force members feel that a commission is the thing that's needed. What's the other thing? Oh, and the kind of the question around what kind of a role or authorities or responsibilities or scope would you want the group to have? Are there other comments that folks want to share about that or conversation?
Can I make a comment? First, I'd like to reinforce what Joanne just said. I think the question of, it's a little bit disingenuous to be told that we need to convince you as to why a commission is needed versus a committee. I think it's condescending, it's unnecessary, and I think we should move beyond that. We want a commission. Whether or not the city council is in a position to set up a commission in terms of legal ability, I don't know. But certainly other cities have done it in Oregon. And I am not aware that in reading what I have read about other cities in Oregon setting up commissions, I have not read anything about the need for a statutory authority under which to operate. Perhaps someone here can clarify that. But if I'm being told that the city council does not have the power to establish a commission such as this, I'd like that clarified.
I can speak to that. Ian Lighthizer from the City Attorney's Office again. I think that one way to think about that is that of the commissions that the city currently has, and again, this kind of goes back to the nomenclature issue, a committee or a commission, and whether there are material distinctions between those two terms, because as I said before, those aren't, to me, really neat and necessarily distinct categories. The City of Bend has a couple of commissions. We have a Civil Service Commission. We have a Planning Commission. I think we have a historic, I'm trying to remember if the Landmarks Commission is a commission or a committee. But and then we have all of these committees that are permanent committees. They exist on a permanent basis. They're in the code. The distinction that we have in the City of Bend at this point is that all of our so-called commissions are bodies that are authorized to carry out their functions because there's a state statute or set of state statutes that authorizes them to do so. There are civil service statutes that require us to have a civil service commission. There are planning statutes that require us to have a planning commission. So that's, I think, the distinction that Eric was trying to make between a commission as we see it, which is tied to a state statute, or a committee as we see it in the city, which tend to be established and live via the code. So that's the distinction that we have in our system between committees and commissions. But as I said earlier, if the city were to establish a human rights or equal rights or diversity, equity, and inclusion committee or commission, we could perhaps call it a commission, but what goes along with that remains to be determined in terms of its function, its authority, its scope, its tasks. Calling it a commission may mean different things to different people. And the examples I pointed out in some other communities were intended to illustrate that, because those other communities have things that they call commissions, but they serve a largely advisory role, much like our committees do. They may have the ability to investigate complaints, try to resolve issues, but they don't necessarily, all of them anyway, have enforcement capacity or kind of an independent adjudicatory function like most people think about when they hear the word commission. So hopefully that's helpful.
So Ian, then I see Ramirez trying to unmute himself, and I'll let him jump in first if he has a question.
I would just like to be clear about something here. I fully recognize that there is the work of the commission, the scope of its functions, and so forth need to be further defined, and that it's quite possible that calling it a committee or a commission may make no difference. That need still exists, that we have to define what the committee or commission does. But I want to point out something very important. A commission, calling it a commission, is a loud and clear message to the communities that we hope to represent. To call it a committee is to belittle that mess, is to diminish the importance, it seems to me. To be told that a committee has been established to promote human rights in the city versus a commission that has been charged to do that, I think carries a different weight and a different message. So to some extent, it's symbolic. And I'm quite clear as to the fact that commissions may not have much more weight than committees. But please understand that this is a period in time when such messages need to be sent out to those who are underrepresented. That's all I need to say on that matter. Thank you.
Yeah, John, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just had a clarifying question. So Ian, then you're saying is that there isn't currently a state statute that state statute this type of commission as it does for like the planning commission. So cities that have commissions are not established. There isn't a state statute that other cities.
That's correct. And what most of them do, and this is hopefully a helpful analog. So the City of Bend's Equal Rights Ordinance, for lack of a better term, it farms out enforcement to either BOLI or a private right of action in state court. Some of the commissions in other cities essentially do the same thing. So they're bodies that those cities set up on a discretionary basis because they could, but they're not required to.
Right.
Okay. Have a question or comment?
Yeah, I think to Mr. Chatterjee's point, whether it's symbolism or communicating something, there might be different ways to think about it. But I do think that calling something a commission versus a committee can resonate in different ways with different people and can carry more weight. The point I'm trying to make, and hopefully the input I'm trying to offer, is just that while I think that's true, deciding on which of those things you're going to call it doesn't answer or even really begin to answer all of those questions about what it's going to do.
And I guess the question that I had in terms of like actions for this task force to develop next actions for an established committee or commission could be clarifying that city ordinance that would set up within the City of Bend's code structure, much like it exists in Eugene or Salem, essentially the structure and functions and authority of a City of Bend Human Rights Commission, correct? So I think there's one of the questions I have is, it seems like the recommendation from this group of stakeholders is that for a lot of reasons, a commission feels like the right way forward, and there's other procedural work that would need to occur for that to be reflected in city code through an ordinance or other function. And so I don't know if that needs to occur for council. And so I wonder, you, Ian, Eric, others, like what comes first? Because I think part of the issue here as well is committee members or task force members are sharing very clearly their desires for how this moves forward. And then the question is, what is the procedural work and who is available to help move that forward so that we have the type of commission that this task force recommends?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're kind of summarizing what I was saying earlier too, of just like maybe there's a way to, I think, get the intent. I'm hearing the intent, and I think that there's good intent. I think there's a way to get there. It's just what's the best, most efficient way to do it? And the code, the council has the authority to set up a code to create, and we could even call it a commission. That's fine. I think, just to be consistent, I think that's what you're hearing from the attorneys, is that we typically don't call things like our Affordable Housing Committee or Economic Development Advisory Board. They're either boards or committees that we don't typically call the commission. However, as that's not consistent across the board, some cities don't have that same type of delineation. But the idea being that if you want to get moving, the council can create this code with the idea, if you wanted to create a true commission that might have enforcement ability, that's where something like a regional effort might be beneficial, where everybody's contributing. That way investigations can be done in schools and other jurisdictions where, the city just offers public safety, community economic development, and infrastructure services. We're not like other cities that might have a broader array of services. So my concern is just making sure we're aligning expectations of what our intent is with this group, and let's make sure we position it successfully so that way it has the broadest impact. And that's where a regional body, and some areas have done that, where it's government entities collaborating, funding, and creating some oversight that really transcends those boundaries. However, there's still a need for something city specific. I'm not sort of like saying this instead of that. It's more of you create, it could be, I'll just paint a picture. I'm not saying I'm not advocating for this. I'm just giving you a scenario of saying a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee that's on par with other committees. They're in code. They have specific scope. They have the ability to influence council decision-making, goal setting, all those things, just on par with all of our committees. That would be more sort of city focused around our own internal diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, making sure our departments are submitting DEI plans that are specific to their operations, and using that body to help review those plans, making sure that there's accountability, performance metrics, things like that. It's also, this group could also help us determine outreach strategies as we're engaging on big projects, making sure that we have an equity lens that we're applying to both our planning efforts as well as deploying infrastructure. So as we're developing our infrastructure plans, let's make sure that we're thinking through those things through an equity lens, making sure our committees, our overall governance structure employs DEI principles as we're in our recruitment and selection process, both externally as well as internally. Kind of oversight of our HR functions. All those are needs that I see. But what I'm also hearing from you all is this need above and beyond just that, and really kind of the restorative justice model that could apply in public agencies. That's bigger. That would be bigger than just city services. That might be something that more of that collective impact model. But that would take some time to explore, and making sure that we get it right, and really understanding kind of the need, and really having, I think, being honoring people, underrepresented communities, to making sure that the problem is being addressed adequately. I hear you in terms of, I don't want to be sort of imposing what I think is the issue, and I want to hear from folks about what the issues are, and let's work together to solve it through the right governance structure. I'm just sort of giving you a picture of what this might look like.
I have just a response to that, because one, Eric, I hear what you're saying. I'm trained through a very similar lens that you are, that, this is like the city of Bend as an entity, and what is its charge and what can it do? And I think that what we've heard from community members is we need this group to be above and beyond that, because we can't wait for that regional structure that you just mentioned. And so this is an opportunity, in my mind's eye, as a community member here, for the city of Bend to be a leader right now in setting up that structure that maybe has a better or has a different regional structure and function in the future, but there's a deep gap right now that's causing harm.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's why there's this dual approach. There could be this collective impact model that we all pool our funding together, get the staff that's needed to support what we're talking about here, but at the same time doing something that's very city specific and ensuring some accountability within the services that we provide. that was, but I'm open to ideas. I'm trying to sort of take information and figure out a strategy, a path to how we create outcomes that everybody is intending to achieve.
I'm wondering if oh, somebody else is trying to talk.
I was just going to add, I think that independent of whether the city creates the infrastructure for then the commission to exist, or if we recommend city council to seek a state statute so that not just us, but all other cities in Oregon can create this. I think the bottom line is we are recommending a entity, a body that has power, that has agency, and that power and agency is given to people of color, right? Again, I hear saying, well, this is what council asked for, or this is what we asked this task force to do. We are here for us, for our communities, and for other community members that cannot be here because this setup is not designed to include everyone. So again, the work we're doing is really not for you, it's for those that you don't see and hear. So I really would like us to focus in the discussion within the city of Bend and what the city of Bend can do. I absolutely believe that we are a region and that we need to work regionally. I am absolutely sure that you know, we can encourage folks to and create a recommendations for the Intergovernmental Council here in Central Oregon. But I think it's really important that right now we focus in Bend and what we are requesting and what we are recommending our representatives, right? And I think we're very clear that we're recommending that the city of Bend creates infrastructure for a body, an independent body that gives agency to marginalized communities to exist so that we can go to somewhere seeking justice, and that somewhere will see us and hear us for who we are and will see us as credible and valuable, right? And unfortunately, that is not what we have right now. So just thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm wondering if there might be a way for us to take this recommendation and really, kind of respecting it and, showing that it's being heard and set up a commission, call it a commission because we hear that that is the message that needs to be sent right now about the seriousness and the power of this. And also, be clear that part of the responsibility of that commission but it's a city commission, that it's, kind of on par with it, created through ordinance, created through the powers that council has, is able to create this. But, and sorry if I might not be perfectly clear because I'm thinking through this as I'm saying it. I'm trying to find a path forward here. So that if we created this, we'll say City of Bend Human Rights Commission, we create the commission through ordinance, and in the ordinance, it says that part of the responsibilities of this commission are to hear complaints. But perhaps we aren't able to, say we hear a complaint about the example Rodrigo gave about mistreatment. Maybe somebody's experiencing mistreatment at the hospital or by park staff or something that the city isn't able to actually do anything about, but at least that can be heard and that can be documented, and hopefully they can give that person some sort of direction of where they might take that complaint. And that can be at least the city's response to this recommendation that we've asked for, is to try as best we can to establish a commission to do as close as possible to what is desired here, as much as the city is able to do that within our powers. And then maybe the way that we could lead is by encouraging each other governmental entity in Central Oregon to also establish the same type of committee or commission, that then, you know, if somebody comes to the City of Bend Commission with a complaint that they aren't really able to take action on, that they could direct them to another entity. And then with it, eventually with the intention of creating this overarching body. I'm trying to think of a way that we can be more immediately responsive to this recommendation and not say, well, we're going to do this in the future. Because I don't hear that there's a lot of trust that that will actually ever occur, even though I think many of us are personally very committed to making it happen. I don't know if that made any sense, but I'm trying to figure out what that path forward is for us with this recommendation.
Jenna, from a legal perspective, that's fairly comparable to what a lot of other cities do through their committees or commissions. An additional component of that, you know, could I think fairly easily be included is not to pick on the hospital, but let's say a hospital. Somebody says I was treated this way at a hospital, and that person goes to the commission for resources, even fact finding. You know, there can be a component of that where a commission could be empowered to go to, you know, for example, a hospital and say, here's what we're hearing. Do you want to engage with our process? You know, it's conciliatory, it's dispute resolution. It's hard to say that it's extending jurisdiction over a hospital, but it provides an opportunity for somebody to get hopefully justice, and if not, help in taking it to the next level. So there are other committees and commissions that do all those things.
Curious, are there any responses or reactions from task force members to kind of the ideas that Jenna and Ian have put out there? I also want to acknowledge that we have a lot of other things, feedback we can review, but I don't want to move past this conversation point until folks have, you know, said everything that they want to say about it for now.
Denise wants to share.
I'd like to sort of ask a couple questions. Thank you all for a very robust conversation. It takes a lot of courage to listen, and it also takes a lot of courage to talk. So thank you, at least from my perspective, to everyone who's sharing so far. So I'm sort of trying to figure out where we are to set aside right now the naming of a commission or a committee. It sounds like you would like this task force to be a little clearer than we have been in what we've submitted about function, authority, scope, and or tasks, to take a stab to go deeper than what we have presented so far in order to help define what this could, to give it more definition, maybe it's a better way to say that. So is that what I'm hearing? Am I hearing that from you all, either from the city or from the council? No comments. That's okay.
So I'm trying not to talk too much, but I'll try to answer that just by saying at some point those questions are going to have to be answered, because if we have a permanent something, a committee or a commission, it's going to be in the city code at some point, and its powers and duties will have to be outlined. So whether that happens sort of sooner through recommendations of this group or later when code's being drafted, I don't know, but those questions need to get fleshed out at some point.
Yeah, I feel like we've been given, I think we've been given some good examples in the recommendations, and it doesn't, it's not a lot of work to go through, click through into, you know, say Salem's code, as I just did before the meeting, to look at what it says. And so I think it might be more of, if there are more specific recommendations or things you like or don't like that other cities are doing, of course we want to hear those. But in terms of just giving examples, you know, I think we have specific ideas. It's just a matter of if there are ones that you think are especially important as a task force, which you have. We have heard that with the, you know, the need for the ability to hear complaints.
May I say something in response? This task force is making a recommendation and has tried to flush out what its views are on what such a commission would do. But clearly, if the city were to go ahead and establish a commission, we would have to do a lot more detailed work, perhaps using other models that exist to outline what its functions and purposes are and how it would operate. That is also a function of budget, no doubt. I think that the immediate concern is for this task force make its recommendations clear, and then it's up to the council basically to establish the commission. And we can certainly provide further inputs to the recommendations that have already been made in that process. But right now, the first step is, what is this council going to do? And from what I understand from listening to some of the others who've spoken today, there doesn't seem to be any great impediment to establishing a commission. I don't still understand all of this talk about the need for a statutory umbrella under which to act. We have a statutory umbrella under the civil rights legislation that exists both at the state level and at the federal level. Is that not sufficient? Does that not give us enough operational room to establish a commission? I still haven't heard a clear answer as to whether or not we can or cannot establish a commission without some further statutory steps, including steps that might require adjustments to the city code. I got the impression earlier that there isn't any impediment to establishing a commission. Am I right or wrong about
So
that?
I think the answer to that, and I'll let Ian chime in, but it really just depends on what kind of enforcement powers that you want to have this commission have. So if you're wanting them to move more towards like a sort of a judicial process, then yeah, that would require state statute sort of.
Well, I think
if it's not that, then probably not.
We made clear in the recommendations that we don't expect to function as a court, and we are not seeking judicial authority on enforcement powers, but we are in a position to have an investigative role, as certain people have already mentioned. We can provide support to those who might want to pursue legal avenues that exist. So we're not seeking, I don't think, I may be wrong, but others here in the committee in the task force can speak to that. I don't think we recommended that we want to establish a judicial body. It's clear that we would play an advisory role. And it's clear that we want also to have some ability to play an investigative role in the event of hate crimes or racial discrimination or whatever, where those who are affected by these kinds of situations have a local body that they can go to that says, help me, and say, help me. And the commission says, yes, we can help. We'll investigate things. We'll look into what you're complaining about. We'll try to play some kind of an intermediary role and resolve disputes if we can. So I think that point has already been made. we don't seek, I think, a judicial role here.
So maybe let me ask the question then. So if you're kind of, if this committee is offering investigative services and it finds discrimination has occurred, what authority would this committee have in then taking action? What's your vision of what authority this committee would have or commission?
Well, the mere fact that the commission has found in a violation to have occurred, or in its view thinks that a violation has occurred, provides the person or individuals or groups involved some weight to carry their arguments to the next stage. Does it not make sense?
I'll let Ian address that. So what would authority, would local code be allowed to create something like that would carry that weight going in somebody's sort of legal recourse?
Well, so a couple different ways to think about that. One, when I think about an investigative function, that's understandable and pretty simple, and something that the council could imbue within a commission or committee. But again, this is occupational hazard of being a lawyer. I ask, what does that mean? And if somebody says, well, that includes something like subpoena authority, the ability to compel somebody to give you documents or emails, I think, well, that gets a little harder. And I haven't heard anybody suggest that, but that's why the details are important. Now, to Eric's question about what if we have a commission that is investigating complaints, trying to do fact finding, figure out what happened to help somebody, in terms of what weight that would carry at the next level, meaning at BOLI or in front of a judge, that's up to BOLI and the judge. But if you have a commission that is familiar with at least the basics of anti-discrimination law and the basics of how a complaint in court or a complaint to BOLI would work, it stands to reason that they would be able to help a party with an issue start putting the pieces together so that that person can be on the best footing possible when they do go to court or when they do go to BOLI. So that's a role I could see a commission playing, and that's a role that's ability that a city council could create in a commission. And really in that regard, it's more of an assistance role to a party that needs help. You know, it's helping them start pulling pieces together to get them prepared to go to the same place that our current code says they need to go if there's a violation. So if that's what this task force is envisioning, you know, I think that is within the scope of what council could do through our code that would establish this body, and part of that would be outlining what it's supposed to do and what its authority is. So that's more of a function that would be attributed to it rather than authority, but it would be potentially significant in helping somebody make progress when they identified an issue. So that's
exactly.
And I don't see that presenting any real, legal impediments in terms of the authority or drafting the code. You know, that's really kind of it's an individual assistance, maybe even advocacy role.
Quite right. If I may, I just point out that a lot of the marginalized communities that we hope to serve are individuals who don't have the resources or necessary expertise or experience to even do the initial investigation. And that is an impediment to seeking any redress legally. And I think having such a commission that has that kind of capacity to help makes a big difference.
And I think capacity is an important word there. Capacity and capability, at least in this context, to me, are a little bit different than authority. I think making sure that expectations are, I don't want to say realistic, but, an investigation, there are different types of investigations and some are more complex than others. And to do the best investigation you can, you need authority that compels somebody to participate in your investigation. That's where it might get a little harder with a city-created commission, but establishing at least at the outset within their scope of work and their capacity to try to do some investigations to help people is something that I think we could do, and it's something that other cities do. That's a common feature of some other committees and commissions in other cities, even if themselves have the ability to, for example, impose a penalty or a sanction if they find that discrimination or other illegal conduct has occurred, but they will help somebody get prepared to go to BOLI or go to court.
Does that resonate with other task force members? Kind of the ideas that are emerging now?
Yeah, this is Jen Rusk. The direction we're moving in right now, what's being shared, feels like it's moving in the direction of what's capturing what we can do and what's most important to me.
Other thoughts or?
I'm just wondering about, I mean, it sounds like we're kind of finally now moving into what was on the agenda, and I'm looking at the document of 710 DEI Task Force Needs and Priorities Summary. So looking at the needs that the task force and priorities that the task force set out, I think it's a question for clarification, is one of the topics of this meeting to be just to get feedback from any city members or council members to just, you know, again, does it make sense to go point by point and say, well, if there's agreement or they need clarification from the task force on the things that we outlined, and or do they see gaps of things that they would want to have added? Or, I mean, is that kind of part of where we're trying to move to?
I could probably speak to that a little bit. Just for your reference, the excuse me, the needs and priorities that we sent out were taken from the materials that were sent to the stewardship subcommittee. So everyone on that committee would have already seen this information, as well as folks at the city. But what I think, if to kind of get to what you're talking about, maybe if we move through a couple more slides because there were other points of feedback, right? If we want to touch on those while we have a little bit of time left here. But I think it feels like, from my perspective, the conversation that you all are having is really fertile in terms of thinking about how to move forward. Is anyone opposed to kind of moving on to the next bit of feedback, or do we want to stay with this topic for longer? Any strong feelings either way? Okay. Well, then why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide, which of course we can still keep talking about whatever folks want to talk about, but I just want to make sure that we get a chance to go over some of the feedback that we got. And I think this ties to the point we were discussing before. I know there were some concerns that came up around staff capacity, depending on, you know, how the responsibilities of this group end up impacting staff, right? I think there were questions of the city was going to formally receive complaints, whatever time would be. And I think
Aaron, your microphone's gotten muffled.
Something's wrong. Yeah.
Sorry, I put my hand over it. I do that occasionally on accident. Thank you. I was just speaking to that, there were some concerns about just being aware of whatever the staff capacity or staff impact would be on the body that's created, what kind of needs the group would have of staff, and just to make sure that, just be realistic about what staff can handle in that way. And I think Bruce already spoke to that, the question around gathering more data to provide more information about the need as it relates to complaint response. But otherwise, some of the general feedback we got was around, and maybe Ian can speak to this because I think this feedback maybe came from Mary, but is that when it comes to kind of the ordinance or the framing at the end of the day, in some ways, obviously you need some details, but in some ways it might be more helpful to think in a way that's broad enough that you can be flexible once the thing is created. Simple language could be more flexible, that sort of thing. This idea that, and again, that Eric and others have spoken to of, maybe there are some pieces of the puzzle that that the committee or commission could be tasked with then further exploring, kind of to get things moving more quickly. And just being kind of aware again about the impact of COVID on the city's budget and resources. And again, right, that the idea that I think everyone we spoke to at the city in particular really wanted to make sure that, and I think you task force members spoke to this in our conversations previously as well, but not wanting to put something out there that sets an expectation for the community that can't be fulfilled, right? So those were a couple other pieces of feedback that we had got. I don't know if staff or council on the call want to add any other pieces.
Yeah, Aaron, I think thanks for making those points. I think that was sort of the intent of maybe this collective model might provide us with more resources to do some of that investigation work. If we all pitch in, then we could get the proper, that was sort of some of the thinking behind the investigative piece. Again, not sort of, we still want to have a city focused committee, but there might be a way to accomplish some of what we're saying if we all pool our resources together to do it well and to do it right.
Any kind of questions, comments, thoughts? I know we've kind of, folks have spoke to some of these already, but I just wanted to make sure we put them out there and so folks could respond to them.
I would like to address a little bit of the concerns with funds. I think that it's a reality that we have been impacted by COVID-19. However, it's also a reality that marginalized communities are historically disinvested on. And so part of our recommendations also come with a change of culture, also come with the idea that equity, diversity, and inclusion, that caring for people that feel vulnerable in this community is not extra. It's actually the very minimum we need to do, and it needs to be embedded within our budget in the city.
No, I completely agree with that. I was just like, how can we do more if we pool our resources together with other local government agencies? That was only my point.
One thing I might add, I don't know if it's a helpful bit of perspective or information, is that, so in my role at OSU Cascades, at OSU they have something called the bias response team that I think serves in some ways some similar functions to what folks are talking about. And just one thing I would share maybe around the capacity or staff impact piece is that particularly when a complaint process is new or people are not very familiar with it, they don't get as many complaints. I mean, I can't obviously predict how many complaints would come through if something like this, were stood up. But I could see in, what, again, Jenna was talking about that idea of if the city were to start with that commission model locally, and then maybe it kind of grows beyond that, then I could imagine that potentially that timeline could align with the cost impacts, right? As like, I imagine there would be a curve to that, and that it would start slow and pick up just from that context. But I just wanted to kind of tie those threads together. Are there other thoughts about this piece, or do we want to kind of move into the kind of more of the bulk of the needs and recommendations and things like that? What feels helpful to the group?
I think it would be great to keep moving, and then maybe if we have time at the end, we can sort of circle back to any other questions.
Does that work for other folks? Let me holler if you feel differently, and we can certainly spend more time here. That we will have another meeting, of course, again in about a week and a half, so we'll have more time to pick up some of these themes as well. Well, maybe we could go to the next slide then. So kind of, again, just to summarize, what we want to do with these recommendations, right? Review the identified needs and priorities to make sure that those still resonate with you all, that they're still accurate, that there's not something missing, and then take a look at the, kind of the recommendation content, reflecting on the feedback that you've heard and discussed, and thinking about, where do you want to take it from here? What, are there changes or revisions? How do you want to structure it? I wanted to, have that opportunity to both take in the feedback from city staff and council members, as well as, again, giving space for, all that's going on in our communities right now. So does that make sense in terms of kind of path forward for the next little bit of time we've got today? So we could go to the next slide. And so this is just a summary of what's, in much more detail in what you have in your materials. But let me know as we kind of just go through these as a reminder if there are things that either seem not reflective of what you all intended, or if there are things that you would want to really add or speak to. So the kind of the needs that I really heard in the meetings, the conversations we had before, was that there's a desire, there's a need for a mechanism to ensure that the voices of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities are included in all aspects of city decision making, right? I remember folks talking about, wanting involvement not just after something's already in the works, but in the planning stages, goal setting, right, kind of all across the board. I heard, a need for more intentional outreach to and engagement with these communities. Also a need for tools and resources to support city council and staff in engaging in DEI work in a meaningful way. A need to be taken seriously and appropriately supported and resourced, right? Financially and otherwise. Certainly that need to have a place to bring concerns or complaints of discrimination, as well as a way to address alleged violations of the Bend Equal Rights Ordinance that don't necessarily involve going to BOLI or court, which is something I don't know has come up in the conversation today yet, but I recall hearing folks, speaking to the fact that, one, not everyone is going to feel comfortable or want to, for whatever reason, pursue those avenues, and two, some things that happen might not rise to the level of being a clear violation, but still be something that causes harm and could benefit from some type of resolution or support. Are there things that task force members would want to add, or questions that other folks have about these needs?
Aaron, I have a question about the first bullet. I'm intrigued by it, but I'm not exactly sure how that would work. I mean, it seems more, I want to say, proactive. A lot of the other things are almost sort of responding, obviously creating a safe place for people to go, but they're responding. Or help me understand help me see in my mind what that first bullet looks like.
I'd love to invite, if any of the task force members want to speak to that first, please do. Otherwise, I'm happy to expound based on my understanding.
I have an example for a role that I play as a planning commissioner for the city of Bend, which would be in the same way that we're moving towards having joint work sessions, where it's not just, for example, planning commission that's getting information from city staff alone, but multiple city committees and commissions together. That, for example, having representatives from this human rights commission at those work sessions as well, where we are all receiving information at the same time in a dialogue, where city staff and other stakeholders are present, feels really important to ensuring that there is a broad range of experiences in the room. And that's just my experience as like a planning commissioner, seeing this group as being extremely important.
Other thoughts on that folks want to share? I guess I can just say, I think some of the examples that came up were things like, being involved at, say, the goals. So really at the beginning of a process, so in the goal setting phase, in the, kind of evaluating new policy or things that are being, proposed, reflecting on things that already exist and giving feedback on that. I think, this point made around not only having this group or, mechanism speak to things that are identified as DEI issues, right? But to really be a part of all the conversations, like I think Whitney was speaking to. Does that answer your question, Bruce, or is there more that would be helpful?
That is helpful, thank you.
Are there other questions or comments on these needs, or things that the task force feels like, should be included in there that isn't? I mean, certainly keep in mind that the full document that you got, will be, there'll be that level of depth in what goes to council. So we're not, it's not just gonna be what's on the slides, but I'm just kind of curious if there are other things that folks would want to add.
As far as needs, I think that most of the discussion that we had as a task force revolve around this need for community members to have a place to go to be heard and seen, right? To feel safe and to seek justice. But at the same time, we understand that that is a response to a event or to a it seems to me like that is a reaction of a need. And so it's also just as important to address the root cause of why these things take place, right? And so I would like to suggest also recommendations for the culture we would like to see within city government. Because we understand that a commission or a committee, it's one group of people, but that those group of people don't necessarily have an impact citywide throughout all of the ways in which we are governed. And all those moving pieces also need to embody a race equity culture, a culture that centers those that are impacted by oppression and that works to distribute resources and power in such a way that that the mechanisms for these underrepresented community members are part of the foundation of how we run government. So we don't have to ask for it as a special thing. Romir also added some feedback to sort of these ideas that the members of the task force would like to suggest to city government. And I wanted to know if it's okay if I put them in the chat or should I email them? What would be the best step to have a discussion on how we incorporate these recommendations? The idea being that government and the everyday actions, the everyday processes are just as impactful and need to be addressed as the importance to have a exterior body that the community can connect with.
Thanks, Joanne. For folks from the city, what would be?
I wonder, Lisa, do you have the ability to let Joanne be, to have her share her screen? Maybe that, if we could do that. Joanne, would you mind just sharing your screen with everybody? That way, that'd probably be the most efficient way.
Yeah, I should be able to do that. Let's see here. 1 second.
While we're waiting for this, can I ask Erin a question about the document that you sent out with this meeting announcement? It's the DEI short-term proposed draft recommendations. And I have a question as to why all of these recommendations are listed as strategies.
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a little, I just don't understand that. I've never heard of, these are not strategic issues as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably also a lot of ways to frame those kind of structures, but I think that document was really just meant to kind of help highlight some of the feedback from city staff as a conversation point, but doesn't have to reflect, how you all structure the recommendations that you submit when you approve them. I don't know if that answers the question, or if staff would have other feedback on that.
I don't, when we do our council goal, it might just be a framing thing. So like with our council goals, we do goals and then we do strategies and then actions under strategies. Some people call it objectives. But it's not worth it. If there's a better way that you want to frame it, that's fine.
Okay. So
So I
what are
don't
we
know,
look?
Jen, do you
What
want
are
to
we
say?
looking at here?
Here we go. So this is sort of a group of ideas that Romir and I work on to suggest or to give us recommendations, additional recommendations from this task force, but specifically speaking to the organizational culture that is needed in place in order to support the success of a commission, right? We can review this. They're rather a little long, but they talk about these cornerstone principles that we need within city government so that city government does not perpetuate oppression on marginalized communities. So we talk about being equity, right? This equity work as an organizational wide issue where senior leaders are setting these race equity as priorities in each department. Having senior managers be engaged in the review of equity issues, right? And having these be at the forefront, so that again, when we are looking at projects, whether transportation or X or Y and Z, our communities are not at the back end of that feedback process, but from the very beginning, right? And it also talks about accountability. Like this work requires acknowledging where we have done injustice, right? Where we have fallen short. And the idea is to change the culture, to have it be okay to reflect and acknowledge when we have made mistakes, right? Because that is really how we gain the trust of the community, right? Good intentions and saying that we have good intentions is not going to have the community trust city government or any other institutions. It is the internal work that is done to change the everyday patterns and habits, what gives the community little by little that sense of trust, right? And this also talks about hiring, right? How important it is to have hiring at the center of this work. The idea is not only that we seek feedback from marginalized communities, but that marginalized communities are part of decision making and everyday governance in all its wide range of existence, right? So we talk about making cultural humility, where marginalized communities are understood to be the experts in their life experiences, a core value of the city of Bend. These are a little lengthy, but they are all based on best practices for equity work. And I would like to submit this to the task force to be added into our recommendations to the city council and city governor.
Joanne, I think you need to emphasize that this document that you've shown is a draft for our internal use, but it does, and it needs to be cleaned up a bit and made presentable. So, but I think you made the point that it's a set of guidelines to help the city undertake its own internal DEI work.
And I'm curious, so are you saying that we haven't done any of that or need to do it over again or something like that? I was struck at least, and again, I'll let you decide, but it looked like a lot of the things on that were things that I feel like Eric said the city has undertaken, we are doing, the council is doing. So I'm I'm curious,
That's,
is your assessment that it's not being done or it's not being done well? I'm curious what to make of that.
well, I think that may well be true, that some of this stuff has already been acted upon. This was drafted by Joanne initially, I think, to reflect her concern that DEI work has to be an ongoing commitment on the part of the entire city government, and that all aspects of the city government need to include DEI concerns. Am I right, Joanne?
Yes, thank you, Ramiro. Thank you for clarifying that this is a draft document. And yes, the idea it is to merge these these concepts of government as how internally the city operates with how externally the city engages with the community, right? Many times the city engages through committees and task force and so on. And what this group is looking to is give recommendations that encompasses all of the aspects in which we as community members interact with the city. Yes, some of these ideas are part of the conversation. However, as community members, we can tell that they're still not embedded as part of the culture. And, you know, the impact, it's superficial still. It's very superficial still. So the idea of having these recommendations is trying to give more weight to the work that the city already started doing, and maybe also provide some feedback or where to realign. I think that if that wasn't a concern of ours, it would have not been brought up.
Does that kind of answer the question you were asking, Bruce?
Sure.
Great. I mean, I think what I'm hearing, the takeaway I'm hearing, the kind of thematically, is that you can't that it's hard to separate the kind of external from the internal, and that the task force members have an interest in giving feedback on that internal piece as well.
Yes, and I think that main purpose is that we want to go on the record providing feedback so that the city knows it has the power to re-traumatize, and the city has the power to further oppress those that are at the margins of society. And at the same time, the guidelines for how to address that internally with the everyday work, with the ways which give power, right? How the processes that are internal have a direct impact on our communities.
I'm curious if on the staff side, if there's any feedback around how, if this is something that can just be folded into the recommendation, just on a procedure process kind of level, how best to engage with that kind of, that side of things, the staff internal piece.
I guess I'd want to spend a little more time digesting it, and then I could sort of answer that question. It would be hard to understand how best to frame that, but if it wants to, if it's just part of the recommendations, that's fine.
Okay. And in terms of other task force members, is this, do you want to kind of dive, I guess, where do we want to go from here? Right? We've got about 10 or so more minutes. Would it make sense to maybe think about where is good to focus at the next meeting? Do we want to look at kind of, additionally the kind of things that were highlighted already in the recommendations that you talked about? What feels like the best use of time for what we've got left today?
I can think of for the next meeting, I think I would like to hear from Ian regarding some structures that we can utilize to have a Human Rights and Equity Commission. I think that his presence actually would have been valuable at the beginning of our meetings so that we had a better sense of how to wrap our heads around these legal constructs, right? So I feel like we're playing catch up a little bit on that sense, unfortunately. So I would like to see some more clear sort of like framing of, you know, the options for a commission and the steps for that.
So just, I can speak to that really. I think Councillor Goodman Campbell commented earlier that we do have, we have models from other in Oregon, frankly, that do all or at least a lot of what we have, or what this group has talked about today and talked about previously. So yeah, we can do that. We have codes that exist that we could and likely would borrow from, because when you're a city attorney, you learn that they steal from each other all the time. So we wouldn't really be reinventing the wheel in terms of if council ends up going forward in the sort of something similar to what this group has discussed today. We do have models out there we can pull from, but if it would be helpful for a future meeting, we can pull some. The group would like to look at them in a little more detail to sort of see what they actually do, but they definitely exist.
Or if you could send them on an email, that's fine too, so we can sort of, you know, glance at some of these other, you know, other ideas.
I think we can, maybe I can talk to Shelley, and Shelley and I can put some things together and then she can distribute them to the group.
I think we have quite a lot of material available on existing models. I don't think we need more. We don't want to burden the city staff with more things to do. Is there a sense that we need more inputs from the city staff? This is to the other steering committee people.
This is Jen.
I would say,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead, Jen. Just from what was linked in our meeting materials, it only took me a couple of clicks of a mouse once I was on each of those city sites to drill down into whatever the code was. So if members of the committee would like that queued up, then I think that's reasonable. But if not, again, just a couple of clicks and I was able to find it, or even a Google search that just said City of Salem Human Rights Commission, it took me to the code as well.
Right. Yeah.
Great.
Jen, did you want to add something? I think you're still on mute, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. Actually, Whitney's response was good. I did not click to those, and if it's that simple that I could go and do that, I would happily do that rather than asking for more. I guess one of my questions was, Ian, if you felt like there was something that would be fairly adaptable that you were already aware of, that might be useful for us to look at. If you had a sense of what might really work for the city of Bend.
I would say Beaverton's code, the City of Beaverton and City of Eugene have codes and commissions that I think are pretty close to what this group started talking about as the meeting went on. Of kind of our local Oregon examples, the City of Salem's is a little bit different. I don't know that I'd call it an outlier, but it contains some features that the other cities' codes do not, in that it includes eventually a process of referral to an issue to their city attorney's office for possible prosecution in Salem's municipal court. So that's a feature that's a little bit unique to Salem, but Beaverton and Eugene have examples that don't include that and are a little bit more in line with the investigation, assistance, and conciliation functions that you've been talking about recently.
Great, thank you.
So I'm wondering if maybe, because one thing I did hear that maybe there's a question that Ian or someone could help around is, what are the barriers and or ways to address if, the creating a commission, because there was all that conversation about statutes and things like that. It might be helpful for folks to have a better sense of, what would the path forward look like in order to, go down some of those different paths. I don't know if that resonates with what folks were saying, but that was something I thought I heard in the conversation.
From the council perspective, what I've kind of gleaned from that conversation was that we can call it a commission if we want to, that it might not perform the same it might not have the same kind of legal weight as the planning commission or other commissions that the city, has in place. But that if council feels that it's important to call it a commission, we can do so without any state statute. Thanks for the thumbs up, Ian. I'm glad I understood that properly.
Thanks for clarifying that, Jenna. I think that's helpful. So for the next meeting, obviously there's a lot, of perspectives that came up to consider today. Do folks feel prepared, or I guess what else would folks need to feel prepared to really dive in next time to trying to really kind of make any revisions and finalizing the recommendations that you all would like to submit?
I'd like some clarification on these proposed draft recommendations that you circulated. The ones that have strategies, 5 strategies. Is that the document that we now have to go to consider as in the next meeting, or what exactly is that?
Yeah, that was really just meant as a different way of framing it for conversation, but I think it's definitely not something that you all have to adhere to by any means. It was just to kind of think about different ways of kind of categorizing the content that you all had shared before. But yeah, absolutely, I think you're free to approach it however you like, from my understanding anyway. Folks can correct me if that's wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess for me, since we have one more meeting scheduled, it's helpful. It would be helpful for me to start imagining how this really rich dialogue gets distilled down into a recommendation to council, and knowing that it needs to be sufficiently specific, but also broad enough to capture everything. So that's mainly what I would be looking for in our next meeting, is getting closer to what that format of our recommendation looks like.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Are there from other task force members things that would be helpful to you for the next meeting in order to really get closer to final recommendations?
What's been recommended so far would work for me. I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
Is the next meeting just of the task force, or is it also include council members and staff, city staff?
I believe it includes people from both those categories. They might have to specify. I think everyone said they were available, but I don't recall. That could be if the staff mix is any different. Do you want to speak to that, Eric or Shelley?
Yeah, I mean, it would be the same group that's on the call today. I think that going back to what Joanne was saying earlier in terms of making sure that we're all synced up, I think it's good to have us that we're seeing the same thing, and because sometimes even just words, they matter a lot. And so I think it's more efficient if we can talk through that. And that way, when it goes to the full council, when this recommendation goes to subcommittee or then the full council, that staff looks to council to make sure that the sort of questions, the framing of it is appropriate. So to the extent that we can be involved, and we want these recommendations to be yours. I mean, that's the intent, but we also want to make sure they work with us within the structure so that they can be heard properly. I mean, we want to make sure the connection is made, and I think that's the intent here. Liaison and with staff is to make sure that there's a some connection being made with the full, working up to that with the full council.
And just to clarify, I think, Eric, maybe you meant to say that council looks to staff for that feedback. I think you might have said staff looks to council. So I just want to make sure that they,
yeah,
I know what you meant, but I just want to make sure they're
sorry. Yeah.
No worries. Well, I want to respect everybody's time and recognize we're at 4 o'clock. Are there other comments? Keisha, did you want to add something?
Oh, just I guess following up with what Eric just said, I guess I feel like this conversation today, we're looking at those strategies, and as he said, are we going to hear more sort of feedback or questions from staff or council to make sure? Because I see the value in us getting feedback, or if there's questions for clarification on what we've proposed, so that it's not going to just get kind of stuck in committee because there was that lack. So is that kind of going to be the agenda of the next meeting, to hear whether there's sort of, yeah, we're on board, we thought that kind of feedback from staff and our council members?
Yeah, to clarify, from a staff perspective, that's really council's role to decide from the policy. We're just wanting to make sure that if there's resource needs attached to this, that we understand what the recommendations might need in terms of staffing, et cetera, that it's legal within a legal context, that we can help to explain council as we looked at these options. And I think we've made some progress today to understand kind of the intent, and then what's the right governance structure to help support that intent. It's those types of things, but really this is the council's decision, not necessarily a staff decision on those recommendations. The council liaisons, I think that's why both Bruce and Jenna are here. They can help share kind of their perspective with the full council, but ultimately it's the council that makes that decision on how to proceed and move forward.
Yeah, and I think this is Shelley. I think part of the resource that we could provide is to help answer some of those questions around the structure and the policy, and then the recommendations coming from this group, from your task force, would be easier for the council to understand in the framework of the city. So I think it's really helpful to have those questions and ask them now with the staff on the call too. Thank you.
May I interject one? This might be a little bit disruptive of what's being planned, but as a member of the task force, we submitted a draft for consideration by the city and council members and you've responded. I think we need time to sort of a little bit of time before the next meeting, that as a task force, to put together our thoughts in response to what has been done so far independently. I don't know if other people here agree to that or not, but I'm a little bit confused by the process that we've embarked on here. This discussion that we had today involved members of the task force, members of the city staff, and members of the council. And I think it's been very useful. And the next meeting is supposed to include the same people. But I wonder whether it's anyone else in the task force shares this view that we need to sort of pull together what our final proposal to the city is, or to the council rather. Am I alone in that, or anyone else thinks?
I think I would like to echo Romir's point of the task force needing a little regrouping to because it looks like we need to look at the recommendations again. I think that we want to add an amendment of recommendations specifically speaking to the culture, the everyday culture the city governance has, but also removing these initiatives. It feels like when we use those words, we take power away from the intention we first put into these words. I think those two things. During this meeting, I had many experiences that made me realize what are those barriers for community members to participate, from the power dynamics to just the access of information. I have looked at different cities and their human rights, but if I don't know to look for the code specifically, then that information escaped me. And so these little things that for some folks that are used to this type of engaging may be a little familiar, a little easier, are not necessarily second nature to somebody that doesn't do that work more frequently, right? So I do need time to read some of what the code are, because I don't know that I look specifically at that within my research, but also because we want to make sure that we amend our recommendations, where we, again, add this piece about the culture we would like to see in everyday governance, but also removing messages like initiatives or ideas, things that take away from the recommendation. It's not an initiative, it's really a recommendation. This is what we would like to be seen. It's not, how about this? See, those two things are very different. So I think we as a task force need a little time to regroup.
Joanne, I'm confused. Maybe you could help me, and maybe it's my inability to understand. When you said take away initiatives, can you give me some examples of what? And again, I want to make sure that maybe we're looking at the right same things. But I heard you say you want to add culture. What do you want to take away?
It's some of the wording that's being used to call our recommendations initiatives. Romero brought it to our attention that some of that language in the document that the city reviewed has altered the intent of our words. And simple words like calling a recommendation an initiative water down the weight of what we're trying to convey. So we want to be able to look at that set of bullet points and make sure that we're comfortable with the wording of our ideas, as well as being able to add this piece of everyday cultural governance. Hope to see that.
Joanne, I think, are you saying the strategy? I think what Ramir was saying was strategy, not initiatives, but strategy 1, strategy 2. And if you want to change that to recommendation, that's totally. I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yes, it was some of that wording that we want to review it, and that's why we need a time as task force to regroup and to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Well, again, we're not here to direct your work, and you can. That's fine. I think what we want to do, what we don't want to do, is repeat from the past of having a. One of the things that we can't do legally is have a recommendation without having public meetings. If there's a group that's meeting to have a recommendation to council, there's no legal way to do that without staff, legal, and ideally with the council liaison. So anything that's forwarded to council for a formal recommendation needs to be publicly noticed meetings. So we're not here so that you have free able to change words and make this your body of work, and that's not what we're trying to do at all. But those just need to be publicly noticed meetings, and as part of that, staff need to be part of that.
Just to clarify, would it be helpful if there were just more upcoming meetings about it? Like if there were, does it feel like it needs more than one additional meeting? Or are there other questions about kind of how to work through those pieces?
Look, I withdraw my, I don't mean to throw, I withdraw my suggestion that we need another meeting. I'm happy to work within this group. I just want to be clear as to whether we're working to present, when we meet like this, if we're going to accept a document that it's fine that it's done publicly, but if we are going to make a recommendation, it has to be the task force recommendations. Am I right? So the next meeting,
Yeah.
we vote on something and say, this is
your
what
work.
this is what we submit. So I'm fine with that, as long as we are clear as to who's doing what. These notes that we got along with this, this set of things that we got from the last meeting that you folks had, wasn't quite clear to me as to who that was coming from. Anyway, I withdraw my suggestion about having another meeting in between before the next meeting.
And just
Joanne, if you want to insist on another meeting, that please say so. Let's go ahead.
I'm just concerned whether we will have enough time on the next meeting to review all of the documentation, clean it out, and be able to, have a vote to finally submit it. So could there be the leeway that if we don't, maybe we add an additional?
Yeah, I think I guess my preference is that you take the time, do the work well, don't rush anything. So if we need to push this back a little bit in terms of how council sees it, and Jenna and Bruce can chime in, I think that's fine. We want to move forward and not stall or anything, but I also don't want, it's that balance. We don't want to unnecessarily rush things. So yeah,
Yeah, and I don't think the idea is to push things back. It's just to have more time together, right? So that we can look at the code from other cities side by side with what we have presented, and make sure that if there is space for us to beef that up, that we do so, right? Same thing, if there's any words like strategies that make us uncomfortable, that we remove those and that we add some sort of everyday recommendations for the everyday activity. So if we can do that the next meeting, it'll be great. But I just want to make sure that we don't set, the task force to be in a crunch and then have to leave things out.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm hearing, right, just you want to be able to take the time it takes to do what you need to do. And I think absolutely. It's just like with today, right? We got through the parts of the agenda we could because there needed to be more conversation. So I imagine that's fine for the next meeting as well. Are there any other questions or comments that folks want to get out there before we kind of wrap up for today and prepare for the next one?
I just want to say thank you to all the task force members. I know that this is really that you've worked really hard on this, and that this can be really taxing work. And so I just want to say thank you for working through this with us and helping council hopefully find a good path forward here. Thank you.
And on behalf of the task force, I'd like to thank all of the city staff and Erin's group, as well as council members, for what they've done so far as well. This is very much of a collective effort.
I want to say, looking forward to continue to work together. You know, we're all part of this community, and I am glad that we are creating space for more folks to participate in governance. So thank you. This is great work, and let's keep it up.
Yeah, no, I'm really impressed with everybody's candidness and willingness to speak up for what's right. And I really want to be partners in helping to move forward and create something that we just, I think, have a huge opportunity in Bend right now to move forward. And I want to be part of it. So thank you for helping to get us going.
I think with that, Joanne, if you have any ideas on how we can increase participation, whether it's technology or different mechanisms to help with that, will you please let me know from a city standpoint if we need to if we can make space available or that's clean and safe. You know, we're happy to do that. But if there's anything I could do to help, please let me know. On that note, would it be okay if I go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 4:16 on July the 10th? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.